Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Robert Owens. Robert is professor of history at Wichita State University, where he specializes in U.S. colonial history and the first decades of the early republic. He's published numerous articles in academic journals based on this history, as well as several books. Today, we plan on discussing his first book, which is called Mr. Jefferson's Hammer. It's a book about William Henry Harrison, the development and settlement of Indiana Territory in the early 19th century, and the interactions that those settlers had with the Native American Indians who lived in that region of America. Robert Owens, welcome. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, sir. Thank you.
So to start with where you grew up and what led you to American history that made you want to study it and make a career out of it?
Well, I grew up in East Central Illinois, as I often tell people, in the middle of a cornfield, basically. And so I did actually have some familiarity and interest in that area that William Henry Harrison was later going to be governor of. After a bachelor's degree, or actually anthropology was my major and history was my minor, I went to the University of Illinois to pursue a PhD in history. And while I was there, I kind of stumbled into, for my dissertation topic, William Henry Harrison and his governorship, basically a decade, the first decade of the Indiana Territory. And actually, it's funny, although I was interested in the conflict between Indians and settlers and so forth, I actually started doing research in that because I took a course and the professor sort of insisted that we do something on white and black relations. And I actually so I started doing research on Harrison because of his policies as governor regarding slavery. But then that segued pretty quickly into Indian policy. And the longer I sort of looked at that, the more I found there were actually quite a bit of sort of intertwining of those two sort of topics as far as Harrison was concerned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed in the book Mr. Jefferson's Hammer, there's a chapter dedicated to the issue of slavery and bringing them into that territory and free Black people in that territory as well. So that's one of the first things you were looking at, and why it was part of your book, I guess, in the end.
Oh, absolutely. Because again, it's well, without regurgitating the whole book, yeah, I mean, it's basically Harrison really wanted to bring slavery fully into Indiana Territory, even though that legally been prohibited since 1787. But he's doing that, and the longer he does that, the more actually unpopular that view becomes. And the conclusion I came to, the longer I looked at it, was, and actually I wrote that book quite a few years ago. I think I would be much harsher in my assessments if I did it again today, was the fact that Harrison's Indian policy, especially after, say, 1805, was mostly to compensate for the fact that he was so unpopular for slavery and for some other reasons in Indiana at that time, that basically buying up Indian land really quickly and cheaply was the one thing that most white Indiana folks actually liked. And so he was doing that in part because, the national government in Washington liked it. Most of the white locals, not all, but most of them liked that. And of course, he's kind of ignoring the fact that it was wildly unpopular, of course, with the native population. And that's eventually going to cause some trouble.
Yeah. You mentioned 1787. Among the important things that happened on that date, well, one of them for our purposes was something called the Northwest Ordinance. Could you say what that was in relation to this territory?
Sure. So when we're thinking about, and we say Northwest Territory, that comes from the 18th century phrasing, the territory northwest of the River Ohio, which has kind of a clunky yet oddly nice ring to it. That Congress, before we adopt the Constitution, because later in 1787 they actually draft the Constitution, but they actually did adopt two really important laws regarding the land of the Ohio Valley. 1785, the Land Ordinance, which basically dictated how the land there was going to be surveyed, marked off, and sold to the public. Not coincidentally, they're actually borrowing a Thomas Jefferson idea to do that. And then in 1787, with the Northwest Ordinance, Congress sets up, and it's actually pretty radical for the time, a process by which essentially the original 13 states are going to be giving up some of their power by creating this territory and these steps where this territory can come into the Union eventually as co-equal states. And they said at the time, well, this is going to become 3 to 5 states. It actually does eventually become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a little chunk of Minnesota as well. So, but the Northwest Ordinance is really important in that sense. In terms of slavery, it's kind of funny. There are all these provisions in the Northwest Ordinance, but Article 6 specifically, and at the time it was like the least controversial thing, which seems weird if you think about what happens later. But Article 6 directly says there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory. And actually, Southern congressmen sort of signed off on that because they were kind of afraid that the Ohio Valley would become competition for them, but down the road. Now, again, I think if they tried to pass that ordinance in, say, 1820, it would have been a whole big thing and sort of massive debate on the issue. But so from 1787, the federal government has said, we're not going to have slavery north of the Ohio River. The thing is, all of the territorial governors, even the one guy named Sinclair before William Henry Harrison, kind of chose to interpret that as being non-retroactive. Largely, this was as a sop. There were a lot of old French colonial settlers, particularly in southern Indiana and southern Illinois along the Mississippi, who actually owned, a few hundred slaves from the previous period. And these governors wanted to make sure that was not seen by them as an emancipation ordinance. It's like, you can keep your slaves. It's just we're not bringing in further ones. Harrison's innovation, though, is he basically, first of all, he wants that repealed because he feels that bringing more slaves into the territory will help the population grow faster. And when he can't get that repealed, the Indiana legislature cooks up this sort of kind of really, almost insulting concept of, well, okay, you can't have slaves in the territory, but you can bring slaves in and then convert them into, and for those of you just listening, I'm using air quotes, have them converted into indentured servants. Keep in mind, A, if you're a slave, you don't have a legal rights, and so you can't really sign a contract. And B, at the time, what indentured servants we still had, typically the contract would be from 4 to 7 years. But I've seen this in Indiana. It was not unusual to bring in, say, a black teenager from Kentucky and have them sign a contract saying they would be an indentured servant for 70, 80, even 90 years. Then the really perverse thing is at the end of the contract, it always says, sort of boilerplate, after which he is free. Oh, well, that's good to know. If you live to be 102, you can get your freedom. So again, it was always kind of shaky legality, but Harrison, and it has enough support in the early days in the territory, he's able to sort of ram those things through. And again, this ties back to the Indian policy. The problem is by 1808, 1809, a lot of people have actually moved into the territory specifically because they don't want to be around slaves, and they are really sort of pressuring him. And this is one of the reasons why I would argue 1809, he jumps back into sort of, let's buy some more Indian land, because he's trying desperately to do something that gets local approval.
Mm-hmm. And those people you mentioned that they don't want to be around slavery, not all of that was their moral standards of not wanting to be around the institution. For some of them, they didn't want to be around Black people, right?
Yeah, no, this is always a really important concept to bring up to undergrads, is especially in this era. Just because you're anti-slavery does not mean you're pro-human rights. And so you're going to see a lot of migrants, and this actually does have ramifications for down the line. A lot of, for example, German Protestants move into Indiana and what's going to become Illinois because, yes, they don't like slavery. That doesn't mean, they actually want large numbers of African Americans to move in there. And in fact, yeah, in the years after this, especially we get the 1820s, 1830s, and so forth, there are a number of laws passed basically to sort of hassle African Americans and sort of make them poll taxes and so forth to discourage them from moving in there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So we brought up William Henry Harrison a couple of times. He became the governor of the Indiana Territory. Could you say a little bit about his background, where he comes from, and how that would eventually influence his decision making as governor?
Sure,
He
sure.
came from a Virginia family.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the conclusions I came to is, sometimes academics we tend to navel gaze and, oh, well, why would Harrison do this about slavery, or why would he be this way around Indian policy? And the conclusion I came to is, well, if we're trying to be fair for 2 seconds, he is a son of the Virginia gentry born right before the American Revolution. How did we expect him to react to these kind of things, right? He is a born aristocrat, even if the family had started running out of money by the time he's a young adult. And so his attitudes about slavery as a good labor force, well, if nothing else, he came by that honestly, right? He was born into that. And the idea that Indian lands were a resource to be sort of snatched away and exploited as quickly and cheaply as possible, that really makes us grind our teeth, and rightly so today. But for someone from his background, it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, they're not,
Mhm.
these guys did not have, degrees in ethnic studies from Columbia in the late 20th century. This is how they saw the world. And so I would argue then, and I'm glad you asked that. If you look at Harrison's background, it's actually a really good predictor. Basically, everything he does after that makes perfect sense, whether or not we like it. It's very much on brand for a son of the Virginia gentry, and I think this is one of the reasons why, when it comes to Indian policy, at least, he and Jefferson are basically hand in glove, because they have this very sort of similar worldview.
Mhm. His father was a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, Big
Yeah.
Ben, Benjamin Harrison, yes. It's really interesting. He was like 6'3" or 6'4" and well over 200 pounds. And William Henry Harrison was kind of a tiny guy, like 5'8", probably like 140 or something. But yes, Benjamin Harrison, the signer, and that's all those guys who signed, like kind of for the rest of their lives, that was their moniker. They were a signer, and also governor of Virginia. And again, he very much comes from this one of the absolute leading families of of Virginia, right? The Harrisons
Mhm.
are up there with the Lees and the Randolphs and so forth. I mean, these are really, kind of old money, if you will, aristocrats from Virginia. It's just that part of the reason William Henry Harrison's going to end up going west to sort of seek his fortune is, like a lot of those planter families, they get clobbered financially during the Revolution. Not the least of which because a lot of their slaves were offered emancipation by the British and took that and sort of ran away. And there's sort of a massive capital loss because of that.
And their homes were targeted as well. Wasn't their
Yes.
home targeted during the
Oh,
Revolution?
yes, and I'm trying to remember if it was actually, I think it was Bannister Tarleton led one of the raids that, yeah, hit Berkeley, the family man. So yes, they saw a lot of property damage in terms of things being burned down or stolen. A lot of their human property ran away, so there's a loss there. There's also a loss of labor. So yeah, a lot of those. I'm not saying we throw a pity party for big plantation owners, but they definitely, a lot of them got clobbered financially
Mhm.
during the Revolution. Absolutely.
And he also grew up in this area where holding land and accumulating land was a way that people, Virginians, had wealth at that time. I've heard the
Hmm.
term used several times that people were land rich and cash poor. So
Right.
did that uh, growing up in that area also come to influence him later as governor
Oh, I think absolutely.
in that respect?
Oh, sure,
Yeah,
sure. And this is the
yeah.
thing is, again, I keep talking about him as aristocrat, but and you can see it especially during his time in Indiana. He is constantly worried about his income level. And it doesn't help the fact he gets married and has a whole bunch of kids, even by early
Mhm.
American standards. And part of the reason he takes the governorship of Indiana is it's a steady paycheck. Uh,
Mm.
he had left the army, but of course the pay in the army was terrible, and he constantly complains about his salary. And actually, I think I did this in the book at one point. If you adjust for inflation, he's governor of Indiana. Normally, it at first is enormous, right? It's Indiana, but Illinois, most of Michigan, Wisconsin. He's the governor of this entire area, and he was making. I think if you adjust for inflation, he was making a little less than what you would get today in the United States as a postal carrier delivering
Mhm.
mail, which is a very important job. Don't get me wrong, but you would think someone who's the administrator for like 4 states worth of territory would get paid better than the guy who brings you your utility bills. And so
Mhm.
he's constantly worried about that. And he's also he's trying things out, right? He's investing in real estate. At one point, he actually opens a distillery, which is a very common thing to do in early America because we loved drinking and we had more corn than we knew what to do with. So yeah, he does a lot of those things in addition to purchasing his own, again, air quotes, indentured servants and having them work on his farm and so forth. So
Mhm.
yeah, no, he's constantly worried about the cash flow. There's no question about that.
So, he goes to his dad wanted him to be a doctor, is that right?
Yes,
And
yes.
he didn't like that idea and decided to join the army. And he saw some action and skirmishes and battles in his first few years and was an officer of some kind. What were some of the things he experienced and learned in his first 4 to 5 years in the army?
Okay. Yeah. So his father had sent him as a teenager, basically, to medical school, and in Philadelphia. And yeah, well, we don't have a letter where he says, I really didn't want to be a doctor, but it seems really interesting that basically, like, shortly his father died unexpectedly. And then, maybe that was a cash flow thing, or maybe it was he didn't want to do this. And yeah, he, calls upon, pulls in some chits as a member of the Virginia aristocracy and gets an appointment as an ensign, even though he's still a teenager, a low ranking officer in the army. And it's actually fortunate for him when he musters in and he heads west, then west to the Ohio country. He shows up in what's Fort Washington, what's going to become Cincinnati, just as the remnants. So this would be in November of 1791. Just as the remnants of Arthur Sinclair's army are staggering in, shell shocked to Fort Washington, and this is the army. It's actually fairly obscure for a lot of Americans today, but it's literally the worst beating Indians ever gave to the U.S. Army, including Custer. Anybody just pales in comparison. Sinclair's army had been lost like 630 killed, plus a number of civilians along with the army, and was just the morale was shattered. And so you kind of imagine William Henry Harrison, his first sort of real assignment. He shows up in this kind of rough-hewn Fort Washington. It's not, this is before Skyline Chili had come to Cincinnati, and he sees these guys who just look like they just walked out of the Tet Offensive or something, and they're just and you kind of have to admire him for not immediately resigning and quitting, but he stays in the army. In fact, General Sinclair's successor turns out was actually very competent, excellent field officer from the Revolution, a guy named Anthony Wayne. They call Mad Anthony, not because they thought he was crazy, but because that's an 18th century use of the term. Mad meaning he was always ready for a fight and he would be good, in a combat situation. I always like to point out there was a Creek war chief at the same time, Creek Indian war chief named the Mad Dog of Tuckabachee, and sort of same thing. It's not that they thought he was mentally unstable. It's like you don't want to fight this guy. And so Harrison had a really good army apprenticeship under Wayne, and I talk about later. Actually, when we get to when we get to the Tippecanoe campaign, he's unfortunately going to forget a couple of those lessons. But Anthony Wayne was very, very good at rebuilding the U.S. Army. You can probably trace the modern U.S. Army kind of actually starts with Anthony Wayne. He almost had to rebuild it from scratch, and he actually trains it very, very relentlessly and very thoroughly, and institutes again a lot of practices that would seem just kind of common sense that hadn't been used before. Like, for example, when you're out in Indian country, you fortify your camp every single night. And I always like to point out, of course, they had dubbed his army the Legion of the United States, and that's what the Romans used to do, right? That's one of the reasons the Romans were so tough on campaign is you couldn't just waltz into their tents at night. They had, built barricades and so forth. And so he does that. He has a good apprenticeship, and in particular, he gets singled out along with a couple of other staff officers for Wayne at the pivotal Battle of Fallen Timbers. That's August 20th, 1794. And the real significance of that battle, aside from the fact that Harrison was, again, singled out for courageously riding back and forth between different units and, braving himself before fire to carry messages and so forth, was the fact that that battle, it's really the first time the U.S. Army had sort of, it's not like they kill a huge number of Indians, but they actually drove them from the field in a panic at Fallen Timbers. And that's actually what's going to set up perhaps even the more important, and actually you could argue, the part of Wayne, the apprenticeship with Wayne that Harrison really learns from. The very next year, in the summer of 1795, there's a big peace treaty at Wayne's Fort in Greenville, Ohio. And Harrison there is able, because he's working like as a secretary, as stenographer and so forth, he really sees firsthand how the U.S. government can conduct Indian treaties in the future, and particular land cession treaties designed to acquire, again, land quickly, cheaply, as much no fuss, no muss, no fuss as possible. And he learns a lot doing that at Greenville. And again, I always, in class, and I don't think I'm the first one to point this out, Greenville really is kind of the template treaty for the future, the next basically 80 years of U.S. And Indian treaties. It's like, yes, we're going to proclaim peace and we're going to promise to protect each other. That doesn't always happen, but Indians are going to have to fork over a vast chunk of land for annual payments, but just pennies per acre, which is how they wanted it. Again, back in the 1780s, the U.S. government had declared the land of the Ohio Valley was worth a minimum of $1 per acre. Harrison, in his future treaties, is going to sort of, almost mockingly sort of apologize for his treaties being like 3 or 4 cents an acre, again, for really good farmland that was quite valuable.
Mhm.
Feel free to jump in and stop me now and again when I get going.
Oh no, it's interesting, and it's all the important stuff to the background of where we're going with all this. I have a couple more questions about
Sure.
people involved here. I'm interested in the role that the British played, both in as allies or neglect with alliances with the Native Americans. And you also write how important it was what the Americans thought the British intentions were, what they were doing in making alliances with the Native Americans, and later what they're doing during the Napoleonic Wars on the sea, impressing people into their navy. So what role did that play psychologically and diplomatically in the west part of the United States at that time?
Yeah, so this is something I've really kind of come to grips with the last couple decades of doing research on this stuff. If you think about Americans of the Revolutionary era and then early on in the 19th century, there are any number of dumb political or policy moves. There are any number of really just embarrassing military failures, but where they are just peerless, where they are fantastically successful, if you're looking at the idea of an American empire, is propaganda, and not just with the way they project themselves to others, but the way Americans, we sort of convince ourselves that we're constantly victims. And so the British are very much kind of the boogeyman for American policy at this point. And at the time, and what's kind of shocking, or maybe not, if you think about American foreign policy, it's not until like a couple decades ago that scholars finally figured out basically anytime there is a conflict with Indians on the frontier and they are resisting Americans coming in and taking their land, whether it's in the 1790s or whether it's, during the War of 1812 with Tecumseh or afterward, there always is sort of this drumbeat. Oh, the British are whispering in the ears of the Indians and they're giving them the bad ideas. again, I keep using air quotes. It's at least 30 years out of fashion. But I'm old. So this idea that Indians would only resist selling their land to us and being sort of forced to acculturate only if someone gave them the idea, right? It had to be the British, and of course that's kind of insulting to Indians' intelligence. But furthermore, something we actually figured out, not like in this century, basically, is it's not that the British are insisting, forcing arms and advice to resist on Indians. It's actually the other way around. This actually goes back to the Revolution. In 1783, at the Peace of Paris, Britain is just, and understandably, they're tired. They want to get out of this. And they make a really generous cession to the United States. They basically say everything east of the Mississippi River, south of Canada, not counting Florida, because that's going to go back to the Spanish. So the Gulf Coast, but everything north of the Gulf Coast, east of the Mississippi, south of Canada, we're just going to cede that land to you. Well, of course, their native allies would have pointed out that's not really your land to give away. And of course, there were no Indians at the Peace Council, and they weren't consulted. Okay, so what happens then is when British officers still in Canada and Detroit, some places even like still within the bounds of this new cession, when they hear about this, they immediately panic, as they should have, because they know that when Indians learn about this, they are going to be furious. They're going to be, and they're basically worried it's going to be Pontiac the sequel, and they're just going to get murdered. And so they actually try to keep the terms of the treaty from the Indians. Meanwhile, the Americans rather gleefully go out of their way to point this out to Indians. Oh, now this land belongs to us. And so how basically British officers in say Upper Canada, which annoyingly is the southernmost part, that's a geography story anyway, or even like posted in the United States, like at Detroit, basically how they avoid getting murdered by their now furious Indian allies is the Indians basically saying, you're going to stay in those forts and you're going to keep handing us arms and ammunition so we can keep these American settlers from pouring into our land. So it's not that the British were ginning them up to resist the United States. It's actually Indians were insisting that the British help them out. So, and that continues. What happens, though, again, events are beyond native control. When the French Revolution kind of starts spiraling into, we'll be polite and say it's a more interesting phase, and you get this sort of massive war going on in Europe, particularly the Anglo-French War from 1793 on. British policymakers very wisely say, we're not interested in some goofy sideshow war in North America. Let's try to not antagonize the Indians or antagonize the Americans, right? Now, that puts British Indian agents on the ground in North America in a really tough spot because they've been making a lot of promises, and now people in Whitehall are saying, dial it back a little bit. And apparently, what we think happened is some of these Indian agents kind of kept very strongly implying that aid would continue to come, and it really wouldn't. So one classic example of this is right after Fallen Timbers, the Native Army, against this really impressive sort of multi-tribal coalition, they flee nearby to a place, actually I was just there this last summer, called Fort Miami, which had only recently been built well within the bounds of the United States. And they run there, and there's a British fort, and they're assuming that the British will let them in, shelter them, maybe even start shooting at the Americans. But the British commandant, for whatever promises the Indian Department has been making, he's under very strict orders. Do not start a shooting war with the Americans in North America. We can't have this. We're trying to take down France. And so he keeps the doors of the fort closed. This is highly irritating to the Indians. Furthermore, Anthony Wayne and his army then waltz up and they start burning down right next door the Indian cornfields. They burn down a trading post where Indians used to get supplies. And of course, the British can't do anything about this. And this is Wayne's kind of heavy-handed symbolism of saying, look, these guys aren't going to help you. Again, kind of unrelated in most respects to the Indian aspect of this, or Indians aren't being included in this, is that same year, 1794, that Fallen Timbers is taking place. John Jay, serving as an American diplomat, signs a treaty, came to be known as Jay's Treaty, with the British that, for what little leverage the United States had, was a was a great treaty in that it prevents a war with Britain that would have been absolutely disastrous. And it also gets the British to agree in writing, yes, we're going to evacuate Fort Detroit and Michilimackinac and Fort Miami and all these forts that were still in the United States territory. But we also had to give up some things. In particular, one thing Southern Americans hated was we also had to agree we were going to stop asking for compensation for all those thousands of slaves who'd run away during the Revolution. We had to officially give up on that one. And at Greenville in 1795, Wayne is going to make, and most the Indians had not heard this. He has translators read that part of Jay's treaty to them as well. And this really, between the defeat at Fallen Timbers and then hearing about Jay's treaty and the fact that the British are absolutely going to be pulling out of this, out of the United States territory at least, that sends certainly the more rational deal-making Indian chiefs to realize, okay, well, we could keep fighting in the United States, but we're going to be doing it by ourselves. And so most of them sign on the dotted line, if you will, at Greenville. Now, in terms of the British as allies, this is going to be one of the reasons why we jump ahead a decade, why the Shawnee Prophet, right, this religious revitalization leader in Ohio and Indiana, and his more famous brother Tecumseh, who's kind of the military genius of the family, they're not huge fans of becoming allies of the British again, because they were both veterans of Fallen Timbers, and they'd seen, it's like, oh well, they're not actually the best, and it's really only going to be in the aftermath of the Fort Wayne treaties in 1809 that Tecumseh in particular gets so angry with Governor Harrison and American policies that they actually start seeking out a British alliance. But for most of this period, honestly, the British policy is, while they want to sort of kind of keep Indians in reserve, if you will, they don't want a war in North America, and they're really trying not to provoke one, despite American propaganda to the contrary.
What was the American interest or worry, perhaps, that the Spanish territory to the west would become part of Napoleonic France?
So there are a couple things at play there, and they're related. First, and Jefferson himself writes about this. Again, 1802, early 1803, these rumors start circulating that Napoleon has secured having Louisiana transferred back to France, and those rumors were actually true. Jefferson himself was concerned in terms of Indian policy. Well, for a couple of reasons. One, as he says himself, the French just kind of have a way with Indians. Now, of course, in fairness, Jefferson had not been able to read Richard White's 1991 book, The Middle Ground. So he didn't understand, well, the French had kind of grudgingly come to this policy that you kind of have to be not super irritating to Indians and, make some concessions if you want to keep them on your side. I'm not sure Jefferson was willing to do that. So he's worried about that. But he's also worried about the fact that Napoleon, whereas the Spanish were not seen as particularly aggressive, and I'm no David Weber, but basically, if you look at the Spanish Empire north of Mexico, it's essentially a story of they just never sent enough people or enough troops or resources. It would have been prohibitively expensive. But so Spanish rule in Louisiana falls pretty lightly. And the United States is okay having them there because they consider them kind of a pushover. Napoleon, however, has already shown by 1801, 1802 that he is a force to be reckoned with. And one of Jefferson's greatest fears is that if Napoleon reacquires Louisiana territory, a Napoleonic army is just going to roll east of the Mississippi River and take away probably the western half of the United States. And that's going to be one of the key features that figures into sort of Jeffersonian and then Madisonian, if you will, Indian policy between 1803 and the War of 1812 breaking out. So there's this very real fear that Napoleon, and Napoleon did have his eyes on Louisiana, although not for, I'm not sure he actually wanted to take over the western half of the United States. He basically was looking at Louisiana territory as a breadbasket for the sugar colonies, like what's going to become Haiti in the Caribbean. Those sugar colonies had, since the colonial period, they never put any acreage into growing their own food or cattle or anything. It was all sugarcane. And so they constantly, through the colonial period and afterwards, they're constantly importing almost everything you would need for daily life from the continental United States or from the colonies. So that's his fear. In terms of Jeffersonian Indian policy, Jefferson has to sort of scramble. It's two-pronged. The very wise thing is he sends a delegation to meet with the French and try and buy New Orleans. And of course, the French one up him and say, well, for an extra 5 million, we'll give you all Louisiana. That's probably the greatest I wouldn't call it a swindle, but it's a great bargain in terms of land purchases. But the backup plan is this is when he really unleashes William Henry Harrison in particular, because Harrison, he's not just governor of Indiana Territory. One of his titles or responsibilities was commissioner plenipotentiary for the territory northwest of the River Ohio when it comes to Indian treaties, which basically means he's the government's point man. And what Jefferson does in very early 1803, he writes Harrison this really kind of blunt, also deliberately private letter, essentially telling him, we need to buy as much of this land along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers from the Indians as quickly and as cheaply as possible. We want a large number of white settlers to move in there. And the idea is then that they will be a militia who can oppose a Napoleonic army. Now, again, if Napoleon had put a sizable army, the Mississippi River, I think, the Indiana Territorial Militia would have been a speed bump at best against them. But that was, again, this is kind of a goal of desperation. It's also, I would argue, it's one of these sort of the contrast of Jefferson. He loves these sort of mutually exclusive ideas, right? The empire for liberty, or so Jefferson wants an empire, but he also wants a really reduced military establishment, right? He slashes the Army and Navy budgets. Well, if you're trying to secure large amounts of land, that's maybe not the smartest idea. And so his Indian policy is basically just sort of scrambling. The thing is, I would argue that Harrison, when he starts negotiating these Indian treaties, and again, he basically, but I just want to say on the record, it really annoys me when people say, "Oh, they got the Indians drunk." There's really no actual evidence for that. There is a couple of his later treaties. There's evidence that Harrison actually said, "Well, you can't have any liquor until we sign the treaty." But he has all kinds of different underhanded tricks. Probably his most effective one was if he's trying to buy a certain parcel of land, he would make a point of not inviting the Indians who actually lived there or hunted there. He would invite somebody else. Get them to, air quotes, sell it and sign the treaty, and then say, "Oh, we're good." And he does that a lot. But again, Jefferson is more than happy for this. He loves the quick land purchases. And the thing is, even after the Louisiana purchase, where you'd think, oh, well, they don't have to panic anymore. Actually, for Harrison, he's figured out, oh, I'm good at this, and the president likes it. And keep in mind, as territorial governor, Harrison is not elected. He is appointed by the president. He serves at the president's pleasure. He'd actually been appointed by John Adams, not Jefferson. So anything Harrison can do that makes Jefferson happy, he is thrilled to do it. And so actually for a couple of years after the Louisiana purchase, the pace of these land sales actually accelerates. Because he's figured out he's good at this. There'll be a bit of a pause after 1805, 1806, but then again, like we talked about earlier, when he starts to get a lot of political flack locally about some of his other policies, pro-slavery, also some people argued he was kind of an aristocratic jerk. That's a matter of interpretation. But the Indian policy stuff, treaties, those were still wildly popular, even though most people 1809, 1810 recognized Indiana was in no way crowded. If you drive through Indiana, even still today, it's not terribly crowded. But 1810, really not crowded, but he's still trying to acquire more lands for settlers.
Mm-hmm. You cite a few times, make reference to letters between Governor Harrison and the secretaries of war, which through the Jefferson administration was Dearborn, and the first administration of Madison was Eustis.
Yeah.
What was the significance of the communication between the Secretary of War and Governor Harrison there?
Well, Terrell, if you were my student, you would get bonus points for an excellent question there. So it's really, I think it kind of illustrates when you think about early American Indian policy that up until the 1820s, Indian policy was actually the provenance, or no, what I want to say, the bailiwick of the War Department. So it was just that's who's, because hey, we may have to shoot people, so we'll have the War Department handle it. And it doesn't become like a civilian run enterprise until much, much later, way after the War of 1812. So yes, when Harrison has problems or when he has to make a report about Indian affairs, he's usually writing directly to Secretary Dearborn, because he's the head of the War Department. That's who handles these things. That's where their budget comes from. I suppose you could say there are parallels to that today. Sometimes in overseas ventures, things that probably should be handled by the State Department get shoved off to the Pentagon, because the Pentagon has way more money than the State Department. So they're doing that. But again, the assumption is, at least up until 1824. So no, the War Department should actually be handling Indian affairs, which I think kind of says it all.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think can complicate our understanding of history is taking our current mindsets and ideas of morality and judging people of the past. What happened in the past is incredibly complicated. There's much to condemn and much to try and understand in its nuance. So in terms of the Jefferson administration and Harrison acting on behalf of that, in how they approached interacting with the Native Americans with things like education, wanting them to take up agriculture, to the degree that they wanted to fight with them or didn't want to fight with them. How can we understand what their mindset was in interacting with them? And I think that's one of the most complicated things to try and understand, is to go back into the early 19th century and put ourselves in their shoes and say, well, they weren't all that terrible. What ended up happening to the Native American way of life is certainly regrettable, and there are many instances we can condemn as history, but I guess I could ramble on trying to get at this question for a long time, so maybe I'll hand it back to you.
Well, again, it's funny. I was talking about that letter from Jefferson to Harrison. The editor of the Jefferson, or one of the editions of the Jefferson papers, like the little one volume one, was unfortunately now late Jefferson scholar named Merrill Peterson, and his title for that letter was Jeffersonian Benevolence. And it's when we think about sort of settler colonialism, right? And again, just to oversimplify, colonialism bad, settler colonialism, where it's not only exploiting resources and so forth, but basically sort of telling the indigenous population, yeah, it'd be better if you weren't here. Probably worse. Again, just sort of oversimplifying. But it's, keep in mind that the Jeffersonian mindset, they're actually probably like the less awful of the two, because again, there were still plenty of people during this era, including in Indiana Territory, who basically just sort of want to go out and kill all the Indians. And Jeffersonians, one of the things they convinced themselves, and Harrison falls into this category again, Jefferson and Harrison actually tried, they were wildly ineffectual, but they tried to keep, because they knew alcohol abuse was a real problem with the tribes, they tried to have an embargo that worked about as well as the modern war on drugs. It's, well, people like drugs, they're going to get them. But they actually try to do these things, and they're convincing themselves that this is, particularly in many ways, I would argue Andrew Jackson in some respects is kind of the logical conclusion to this question. Jefferson's basically assuming, starting with the assumption that Indians, the best case scenario is they assimilate and live exactly like us. He doesn't seem to have quite the sort of biological racist attitudes towards Indians that he does towards, say, African Americans, which makes the Sally Hemings thing all the weirder. But at the same time, there is this sort of really heavy dose of ethnocentrism and the idea, well, obviously you should want to live exactly like us, dress like us, farm like us, do these kind of things. And so, and that's actually one of the reasons, oh, I need to circle back to Louisiana Territory. That's another reason Jefferson doesn't want Napoleon moving into Louisiana, is he's looking at the Louisiana Territory as essentially extra closet space where he can toss Indians who don't want to get with the program. And again, in Jefferson's mindset, this will all work out wonderfully. Again, if you study the history of Indian removal, no, when Cherokees and Delawares and Shawnees and others start showing up west of the Mississippi, they are not welcomed by the people who already live there because it's just more pressure on resources and so forth. In terms of this, but yeah, it's again, I think what's hard to get a hold of is the fact that at least on the surface level, men like Harrison and Jefferson have managed to convince themselves that, well, this is all for the best. Again, because they are assuming that this sort of Indian way of life, and again, they're not sort of kind of taking into account that, well, populations and cultures change. They've convinced themselves that essentially Indians are going to go extinct if they don't change. And in particular, Jefferson comes away, again, I'd say, argue he convinced himself that, well, if Indians would just sell us most of their land and then take up our style farming, it's better for us because we get this land cheaply, but it's also better for them somehow. Again, he really likes these sort of kind of ridiculously simple and wildly optimistic solutions to problems. But I guess this idea that, well, it's better for everybody if everybody lives like an Anglo-American style farmer and develops this. And again, that's actually sort of key to Jefferson's sort of view for America's future. He wants this continually, what he calls the empire for liberty, is this continually expanding nation of small independent farmers. It's also kind of psychologically fascinating. He almost never refers to himself as a slave owner or a plantation owner. He calls himself a farmer, right? Because he thinks, well, that's sort of morally superior, independent bent. And let's be honest, he's not out there behind the plow, right? He's not out there hoeing wheat. He has some other folks doing that for him. So, but yeah, that is a very common thing. And basically, in the early 19th century, the debate, whether someone like, say, Jefferson and Harrison, or more the older Federalist bent, say George Washington, John Adams, the end goal is basically the same. I think, again, the oversimplified answer is the Federalists were a little more patient, right? Had John Adams continued to be president, he wanted that land in the Ohio Valley, but he didn't have to have it in the next 2 years. He wasn't, they were a little more patient with the idea, and basically, the concept is, well, Indians will get the hint eventually, and they'll either adapt or they will remove themselves. The Jeffersonians want sort of really, really shockingly fast assimilation. And actually, kind of what's weird, if you move past the War of 1812, they kind of get it, which makes the period of Jacksonian removal even harder to take, because again, if you look at like the Cherokees or the Creeks, they literally had done everything they were asked to do, and then they get asked to leave their land because it's valuable. It's, that one is much harder to swallow than,
there was gold in that area. That's the reason they wanted to expedite that.
Well, so for the Cherokees, that is maybe the final straw. They developed gold, but part of the problem is when we get the Cotton Revolution, especially by the early 19th century. Again, if you read, say, Andrew Jackson, like back before he's president, he has been lusting after the lands of the Creeks and the Cherokees since the early 19th century, because they know, and of course, part of the bitter irony is Creeks and Cherokees, the wealthy ones, they've bought their own black slaves and they're growing cotton, and they're getting fantastic yields, because there are stretches of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi that are wildly productive for cotton. And, by the time Jackson is president, especially, it's like, well, we want that land for ourselves. So I think Jacksonian removal would have taken place with the Georgia and the Cherokees. That probably would have taken place regardless of the gold. The gold was just kind of like, the last straw, if you will. Again, if you study, historically speaking, when people hear that there might be gold someplace, they tend to lose their minds. And so, that hasn't changed.
So would you say that's a departure from the Jeffersonian way of thinking, that these Indians were taking up farming and living in the way that they envisioned, but the Jackson view was, well, this land's quite lucrative and we want this for ourselves?
Race rather than, and again, Jackson, of course, Jackson's rhetoric, it's interesting, it's Jeffersonian in a sense, or the idea, Jackson, I think, willfully ignores the fact that these Southern Indians had acculturated and assimilated to a huge degree and in a shockingly quick amount of time, because he wants that land. Now, Jefferson, that's an interesting question. I've I tend to be, and other people would argue against this, I tend, when it comes to that stuff, to take Jefferson at his word, although there are times you catch me on the wrong day as, oh, I'm not sure he deserves that. But Jefferson had actually said, during the American Revolution, he says to various Indian chiefs, well, we're all Americans. And he basically, for lack of a more articulate phrase, he seemed to have this idea that Indians, at least if you believe what he says in writing, that Indians would, if they would assimilate, would make wonderful white people, essentially. Whereas, again, he's going to maintain his entire life that African Americans simply don't have the mental capacity to do this. He basically sees Indian culture as inferior, but not Indians like biologically or as a people. Although, again, I mean, had he been president in the 1820s, who knows, right? He might have been much closer to Jackson. It's hard to say. I would argue, again, that the Jacksonian policies, in many ways, it's kind of almost more like a kind of a brutal realpolitik version of Jefferson. Again, Jefferson never wants to be seen as the one holding the bloody knife. He does want people to get stabbed. He just doesn't want to be seen as the one doing it. So it could be I've been entirely too generous in taking him at his sort of written word. Because again, the policies sometimes deviate noticeably.
But there are some instances like when smallpox vaccines become available, he also wants them distributed to Native Americans.
Oh yes.
Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, you please go ahead. Yeah.
Leaping in. No, this is the thing about well, actually, we need to go back then to the Washington administration. One of the differences between sort of previous forms of settler colonialism, and a lot of this has to do with the way Americans see ourselves. But if you go back to the Washington administration, you can read the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and Washington writing back and forth. And there's this sort of weird juxtaposition. On the one hand, we want that land. We have to have that land in the Ohio country and south of the Ohio River. We need to sell this to Americans, get it settled, bring some money in. But at the same time, they are acutely aware, because of course we've told ourselves during the American Revolution, our victory was so far-fetched. Clearly, we are God's chosen nation. And there's this real sense, especially as you get into the 19th century, that the optics matter. And Knox and Washington, for example, say basically repeatedly, we don't want to look like the conquistadors, right? We don't want Anthony Wayne to be seen as the successor to Cortez or Pizarro. And so they are, and that's why you get these what seem kind of odd two steps. Again, the whole point, actually, I should have backed up to Anthony Wayne's campaign in the Ohio country was by the ordinance of 1787, the U.S. government has officially declared Indians actually own their land, and it has to be purchased from them. We can't just sort of take it under conquest theory. But part of the reason we end up still having needing Wayne's campaign is the fact that the Indians didn't want to sell. And so there's this idea, well, we need to beat the crap out of them so that then we can treat them as a benevolent power. It really, it makes 18th century sense. It sounds really weird in the 21st century, but we need to sort of slap you silly so that we can and then help you up. But again, so and you get these weird sort of kind of contradictory impulses between, again, how do you become an imperial power without seeming like a bunch of mean people, conquistadors, and they continually struggle with that. Again, and you do point out, again, by the time you get to the Jacksonian era, well, they are effectively, at the very least, affecting ethnic cleansing, or it actually does check some of the boxes for genocide, but they're not using they don't have to use a massive military campaign to get that done by that point. And that's kind of how they wanted to do it.
In the Indiana Territory, this political disagreement arises between what's going to become Illinois and Indiana. These two separate. What were the disagreements that frame that debate, and what was the significance of the term land jobber in relation to that?
land jobbers that they don't call people land jobbers anymore, and they really should,
No.
right? It's basically crooked. We don't call people land jobbers, and also no one dies of brain fever anymore. If you, it's really a shame linguistically. So the debate in Indiana by 1808, 1809, Indiana territory first, well, let's see, 1809, Illinois separates. So in 1808, Indiana, they've lost what's going to become Michigan territory. They've lost what's going to become the Wisconsin territory. It's basically just what's going to be the future Illinois and Indiana. And increasingly, Harrison has been, you know, and again, I don't think it's coincidental. This is why he shoots for a bunch of new Indian land cession treaties. It's all very, interconnected here. In 1809, he's having political problems because the anti-slavery folks are getting increasingly vocal. And again, they can't quite vote him out of office, but they are writing petitions repeatedly to the national government saying, we don't like this jerk Harrison. Keeps trying to introduce slavery here. We don't like it. And what's interesting, and part of the reason, again, Harrison's going to be in desperate political straits is a lot of the folks, the leading citizens of Illinois territory at that time, again, largely at that point in its history, the power is all in the southern part of the state, along the Mississippi, along the Ohio. Those the leading citizens there were very much pro-slavery, but they end up petitioning and getting cut off from Indiana. Not that they disagreed with Harrison so much, but because they are afraid that the growing southern Indiana anti-slavery population is going to curtail their pro-slavery dreams, if you will. So Harrison in 1809, when Illinois leaves, suddenly a huge chunk of his constituency has now left, and he's left with these folks in Indiana, southern Indiana at this point, who are increasingly rabidly anti-slavery, as we talked about, not necessarily civil rights activists, but they don't want slavery, and they're ticked off at Harrison about this. And so that is going to be one of the reasons, again, that pushes him into kind of risky liaisons, if you will, in terms of Indian land cessions. Land jobbers, again, it's just there's so much of that in this era, and it's also probably worth noting. I think it's Malcolm Roorbaugh's book, The Land Office Business, is a really good sort of study of this. In this era, especially, or maybe even today, there was really not this sort of sense that just because you were holding public office, that you shouldn't be trying to use that to privately, profit. And so there were a lot of sort of shady. I don't think we have enough time to go into each of them individually, but there was a lot of sort of shady land deals going on at this time of guys who had essentially inside information and influence because they were officers of the territorial government of one hand or another, and they're accused of land jobbing. And a lot of times, I think the accusation was accurate because now whether this was strictly speaking illegal or enforced, that's trickier. But certainly there were a number of folks who seemed to be, at the very least, trampling on the spirit of public office holding in trying to profit from various land acquisition deals, whether it was Indian land or sort of selling public lands. The guy actually who ran the U.S. saline works, salt works in what's now southern Illinois, they think may very well have been taking kickbacks essentially and profiting. He ends up dying at the Battle of Tippecanoe, so that kind of squelched any further inquiry into that. But so there's a lot of that stuff going on, land jobbing, and basically sort of today we'd consider kind of crooked politics for profit. Of course, I suppose the counter argument would be, well, if you'd paid them maybe a little bit better, if you'd paid them better than mail carriers, maybe they would have done this less. But who's to say?
You mentioned Tippecanoe. I'd like to steer towards that battle and Tecumseh and his brother, but maybe before we get there, to set it up, could you talk a little bit about how Native American tribes, and I don't know what term you use, but I follow, say, Francis Fukuyama or Max Weber, who say a tribal level of organization is a distinct society that has, say, several hundred people. And I think one of the things that's really important to understand is these different Native American tribes are distinct societies. and they have history of trading and conflict with one another. And
Hmm.
the fact that they are distinct societies, sort of, the Americans figure out that one of the best ways to interact with them is to, get in the middle of them, or play them off one another. And
Yes.
that is from the landing of the Pilgrims in the 17th century all the way up to the 19th century. That's a big part of how Americans are interacting with these groups. And
Hmm.
it's in many ways a weakness of the Native Americans in dealing with America, is
Sure.
that they
Sure.
are distinct societies. But when we come to Tecumseh, he has a sort of a different vision about this. But perhaps before we get there, you could talk on that subject to set us up for that.
Sure, sure. Well, in terms of terminology, I'm sorry. The very unhelpful answer is it kind of depends. Again, some Native Americans prefer to be called Native Americans. Some prefer to be called Indians. Some want to be called indigenous peoples. In terms of tribe versus nation, a lot of times when I'm writing, I use nation simply because that's the language that the U.S. government used. Although sometimes for nefarious purposes, right? Or sort of for arguments of convenience. It honestly just does depend. Just one quick example. The Seminole Indians who remained in Florida and avoided removal, they are officially known as the Seminole tribe. The Seminoles who ended up going to Oklahoma, they are called the Seminole Nation.
Mhm.
And I am told by a very talented former graduate student, they don't like it when if you meet someone of the Seminole Nation and you refer to them of being of the Seminole tribe, it's a little fingernails on the chalkboard. So
Mhm.
I guess what I would say is, Terrell, good luck with that in terms of this. But yes, this is when we say Indians, or if you're talking about Africa, when you say Africans or Asians, that's implying the sort of unity of purpose and vision that is just not remotely there.
Mhm.
And yes, that's one of the things that William Henry Harrison ends up being very, very good at is playing off one tribe against another. And of course, the U.S. government, and this is officially, I mean, it kind of starts during Washington, but it's absolutely official policy by the Jefferson administration of essentially using economics to sort of drive wedges and sort of manipulate tribal politics. Jefferson's phrase, in a lot of contexts, he would say he preferred to conquer through commerce rather than arms. Because it's less bloody and also it's cheaper. And Jefferson is a great cheapskate, at least when it comes to federal money. So this idea then that one of the things I think it's interesting that Americans, we have this sort of fascination, especially, well, really within 6 months of his death, of Tecumseh. Part of the fascination comes, we can sort of see this goal of building this sort of huge intertribal coalition, right? And basically the idea is sort of all Indians against Americans would say against all white people. Actually, Tecumseh was okay with the British and the French and the Spanish. It's the Americans he has the problem with.
Mhm.
That's a little American propaganda there, but this very ambitious goal, and yes, it seems to make sense. On the other hand, in many ways, that's the Achilles heel, because of course, it's not a new idea, right? This had been tried in the 1670s in New England. It had been tried by Pontiac in the Ohio Valley in the 1760s. It's really hard to hold these multi-tribal coalitions together, because again, as you noted, Shawnees and Delawares are actually sort of pretty close, but Shawnees and Potawatomis, or going to the south, Cherokees or somebody. Well, they have a long sort of history that's fraught, not always getting along with each other, and they tend to see things differently. And this is actually one of the things when Tecumseh, shortly before the War of 1812, goes actively trying to recruit particularly Indians in the South to his coalition. Again, his biographers and historians, we tend to sort of obsess of how cool this was and ambitious, and sort of kind of glide over the fact that it's wildly unsuccessful because it's so difficult to do. And one of the basic problems is you have Tecumseh going to these various Indian nations, Choctaws, Creeks, Chickasaws, whomever, and essentially he's trying to sort of say, hey, why don't you send your warriors and I'll lead them in battle against the Americans? And the existing chiefs are saying, yeah, why would we do that? Who are you again? No, we're not interested in doing this. And if there's going to be a multi-tribal coalition, why would you be in charge? Why not me or somebody else? So it's a really, I mean, it's probably the only play Tecumseh had to make, right? But it's the odds for success were really, really long. And also, I think John Sugden and others would point out, even if he had been wildly successful and gotten every single Native American east of the Mississippi on his side, it's still, and that was never going to happen, but just numerically, the United States by that point, they're too many people. It's just weight of numbers, if nothing else. They, in a military conflict, they're going to win. It's going to be, I mean, or let's say there's a 95% chance they're going to win. I mean, it would take a really sort of huge string of disasters for that not to be the case. But yeah, and then that, of course, is going to play out quite a bit during the War of 1812.
And as we move towards the end of our conversation, I'd like you to talk about what the Battle of Tippecanoe was, and then maybe we could end on how William Henry Harrison used his legacy in the Indiana Territory, the Battle of Tippecanoe, to eventually get elected president.
Sure. So, Tecumseh, I think we rightly regard him as kind of a genius, but he makes one arguably boneheaded move in 1811. In the summer, he has a conference with William Henry Harrison down in Vincennes. That was the capital of Indiana Territory. It's right on the still a very charming little town today on the Wabash River. And at this conference, again, there's really nothing to accomplish because Tecumseh is basically, his argument has become, and the prophet along with, they're actually more or less hand in glove on this. We don't think Indians should sell any land to the United States unless all Indians agree. Well, of course, that's not going to happen, and I think they knew that. Harrison's policy is, I'm going to buy as much Indian land as I can. So they're really just kind of, they're not going to agree on it. Well, the bonehead thing Tecumseh does is, rather than going back up north to his brother's village on the Tippecanoe River, near a place that's now called, spoiler alert, Battleground, Indiana, Tecumseh tells Harrison, I'm heading south for a while, and he tries to dissemble. He doesn't admit he's trying to recruit Indian allies. Oh, I'm trying to recruit some followers for my brother's multi-tribal religious mission. Harrison, of course, sees right through that. But Tecumseh says to him, and I hope you're not going to cause any trouble while I'm gone. And then Tecumseh heads down the Wabash to the Ohio River to start this long, sort of very ambitious journey. And Harrison, of course, immediately thinks, well, if the military genius is away, this would be a really good time to sort of nip this growing Indian movement in the bud. In particular, there were several things, there are a couple of things actually about the Prophets movement Harrison liked. It was anti-alcoholism, for example, but particularly this idea that you shouldn't make deals with the U.S. government, and in particular, you shouldn't sell land to the United States. That Harrison, that's not going to fly, right? So Harrison, as commander of the Indiana militia, he's right, he has the right, he forms this army, about 1,000 men, and he marches up into what was then Indian territory, so north of what's now Terre Haute, and invades Indian territory under really kind of sketchy justifications. Part of the problem is the Madison administration by now, they're so far away, they're hesitant to give him really firm orders because the nightmare for them politically is, well, what if there is an Indian war and we left the frontier undefended? We're going to look bad. So in November of 1811, Harrison has marched his army, mostly militia, but there are some U.S. regulars with him as well. They get outside of the Prophets village, Prophetstown, on the Tippecanoe River. And November 6th, 1811, they have this really kind of uncomfortable conference where the prophet's like, Governor, what are you doing here? And basically, Harrison tells him, well, you need to disperse your followers and everybody sort of leave. Otherwise, we're going to have a real situation here. Now, again, think of the timing. This is November in sort of, central or north central Indiana. This is not the time you want to establish a new village, right? You're trying to hunker down for winter at this point. So that was kind of a non-starter. The one thing I do say in the book, in Harrison's defense, while this ends up in retrospect being a terrible, seemingly a terrible move, a lot of frontier citizens at the time, including William Clark, was the governor of Missouri Territory and of William Lewis and Clark fame. He thought this was a good idea. Again, the idea you need to take a bold action. Indians only understand force. William Clark's older brother, George Rogers, would have said the same thing. Indians only understand force. You need to disperse. The idea is we're going to nip this in the bud. So November 6th, Harrison and the prophet retire. Harrison back to his camp. The prophet goes back to his village. And they said, well, we'll talk again tomorrow. But both of them almost certainly leave that meeting thinking, yeah, there's going to be a fight tomorrow. And so what happens is Harrison is not a complete moron. He has his men sleep in their uniforms. They have their muskets laying by their sides and so forth. But one thing he should have learned from Wayne was you always fortify the camp when you're in sort of potentially hostile country. And he didn't do that. And I've never come up with a great explanation for why that is, although there's some documents from like a year before where you actually, I think he was complaining to the Secretary of War, they physically could not get enough axes made. You would think on the frontier they would have had axes coming out their ears. They didn't have enough axes and entrenching equipment with the army. So Harrison's men, they're kind of on alert, but they're sleeping with their uniform and so forth, but there are no barriers. And the prophet, after consulting with some of the other war chiefs who think, this would be a good idea, let's go in and stop Harrison. Keep in mind, the prophet has about half as many men, about 400 or 500 fighting men at the most. But the idea is they're going to go quick sort of coup de main strike, right? They're going to, in fact, they had like a hit squad that was supposed to take out Harrison specifically. And the prophet supposedly, I'm never 100% sure whether this was actually real, but the story is he promises he's going to pray and the American army will be just sort of defenseless and they'll be able to wipe them out without any casualties. Well, what happens is a firefight ensues shortly before the Indians actually get into the camp. A sentry fires his musket, and there's this very brisk firefight. And initially, the Americans actually get mauled pretty badly. And in the aftermath, by the way, Harrison's going to take a lot of criticism politically. One of the officer corps just really gets decimated. And in fact, one of the higher ranking guys was actually, he was the district attorney for the U.S. attorney for Kentucky, but he was a Federalist, not a Jeffersonian like Harrison by this point. And he gets killed. And there were very unfair accusations afterwards that, Harrison sacrificed him. Nothing could be further from the truth. But the American army takes like worse than literal decimation, more than 10% killed or wounded. The prophet takes, probably half of that. But in the aftermath, what happens is because the prophet's men start running out of ammunition, they do actually have to abandon Prophet's Town and avoid it. So Harrison is able to claim victory in the aftermath because they do waltz into Prophet's Town later and sort of burn down what was left of it. But I always point out it's really weird that this becomes sort of the basis for his future political career, because early, again, you could look at the numbers saying, well, this is at best a draw. And in fact, some of the earliest newspaper accounts reported this as an American defeat, because again, so many officers got killed and a fair number of enlisted men as well. And so it was not, like a great day for American arms. But the argument I make is one thing Harrison absolutely had, if not enough axes and entrenching equipment. He had, after a decade in Indiana, he had a fantastic PR machine. And, and again, it's probably not a coincidence that the only newspaper editor in Indiana, for example, was a friend and a neighbor of his. And so he's able to sort of control the narrative after this. And of course, the Madison administration is perfectly willing to go, oh, yes, Tippecanoe is this great American victory, because they don't want to admit they just got spanked out on the frontier. So, and that later in this eventually is going to lead to Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which I would say the best part is it rhymes. I'll give them that. But it's really weird. If you look at some of the actual combat that Harrison, when he becomes a general in the U.S. Army in the War of 1812, he has some true accomplishments. In particular, at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, his army is going to kill Tecumseh and send the British just sort of scurrying for their lives. That was a real achievement that ended up not being, but could have had real strategic implications. And yet it's always, for the rest of his career, they always sort of lead with Tippecanoe, and then the sort of other stuff they kind of bring in afterwards. In terms of his goal, I always liken it to Harrison sort of saw, in terms of, what do we do with Prophetstown? Harrison sees a hornet's nest hanging from a tree limb, and he says, "Oh, I can fix that." And he takes his sword and he knocks it down. Well, okay, you've destroyed the hornet's nest, but now you've got a bunch of really angry hornets just zipping around, and they're not in one place where you can keep an eye on them. And again, I wouldn't be the first person to point out more than a few isolated settler cabins in Indiana and Illinois in the months after this. People get murdered, and it's probably there's a good argument to be made. These are actually guys, warriors who had lost a friend at Prophetstown, and they're out for like a revenge killing. So he does not, preclude. Again, just to confuse students, I would say, well, the War of 1812 actually starts in November of 1811, at least out on the frontier. But he
Yeah.
nevertheless he does parlay that. He plays that to the hilt for the rest of it, even in 1840. Right, they have this big political rally. Harrison's the Whig campaign in 1840 was kind of marvelous in that they were very good at sort of doing stuff that we recognize in modern campaigns, like rallies and trinkets for the campaign and so forth. But they had this huge rally. I think it's tens of thousands of people showed up at what's now Battleground, Indiana. It's a state park, and had this big rally, and they're sort of celebrating this. And here's why you should vote for him, because he forgot to bring axes. I never fully understood the argument, but so yeah, it's definitely a seminal event for his political career afterwards.
Uh, Today, the area where the Battle of Tippecanoe happened, it's a preserved site that one can visit.
Yeah, they have
Uh,
a very nice. In fact, they just updated museum, and there's a park. Oh yeah, I should. I was just there like a summer ago. I could have brought you a bunch of pictures. No, there's like a big monument, and it lists like all the names of the soldiers and the officers who were killed. Most of the officers, there's like a little stone monument in the sort of general location of where they fell. This was actually a big thing for Harrison and a lot of the veterans of that battle. This was a big deal, and they spend like the decades after it, first making sure that the site would be protected, and eventually becomes a state park and sort of a kind of an ongoing memorial. Yeah, no, it's actually a really neat. It's very near. I don't know if you have folks. It's quite close to West Lafayette, Indiana, the home of Purdue University. So it's again, I grew up like an hour and a half away from there. It's actually a really neat area, particularly in the fall. It's gorgeous. The hills and trees of that part of Indiana, it's just quite lovely. And yeah, that park is actually like a cool place to go, take a picnic or something. But yes, it absolutely is available for public viewing.
right. Well, just before we say goodbye, let me just list the names of your books again.
Oh, okay.
So today we were talking about Mr. Jefferson's Hammer, and it's about William Henry Harrison and the origins of American Indian policy. I've written another book called Red Dreams, White Nightmares, Pan-Indian Alliances in the Anglo-American Mind. That's 1763 to 1815. And in 5 days from now,
Just dropped. I think you can actually get it on Amazon now. Yes.
oh, you can. Okay.
Yep.
On mine, when I checked, it said February 20th. So I guess
They
it's now
did, but
available.
they're usually a couple weeks early. Yeah, they sent me my
Uh,
copy like a week or two ago. So
right. So that's Killing Over Land, Murder and Diplomacy on the Early American Frontier.
yeah,
So if
not the best right before bed reading, because it's just a lot of really horrible things happening. But yeah,
right, but everyone can look forward to getting that one. And I hope after I read that one that maybe we can get together again and talk about it.
oh, absolutely love to. No, this has been fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun for me too. Thank you.
All right, take care.